Good afternoon.
Hello.
Afternoon, everyone.
Hi, everyone. I have a funny feeling that we've shared the wrong link because I think everyone's joined as a presenter. So be aware that you might not be muted, and please be cognizant of that. In any event, we're just going to give it 2 or 3 minutes before we actually start the event, so please bear with us. We do have quite a high turnout today, and just want to make sure that everyone gets into the room before we start. Welcome to the people just jumping in. We are just going to wait another minute or two and then kick off. In the meantime, thanks for joining us. Getting close to the right number. In fact, I think we'll probably start now. Welcome again to everyone to another Bites and Bytes session. A lot of you are returning guests, and we appreciate that. A bunch of you are brand new. This is your first event with Turrito. So quick intro. These Bites and Bytes sessions are meant to be very quick, very to the point. We do them in the middle of the day. Over lunchtime, we send you an Uber Eats voucher. Hopefully you've taken advantage of that. And the idea is that you have your lunch, you have an informative session around certain topics that we prepare months in advance, and that it doesn't waste part of your valuable day, and that hopefully you learn something. As I always say, we love your input. So if there's any topics that you'd like us to cover in the future, please let us know. Please respond to the emails you've received and give us any other topic ideas. We're going to leave Q&A to the end. Sometimes we have fluid sessions where you can interrupt, but in this particular session, we'd prefer you to either type your questions into the chat or wait until the end, and we'll cover your questions then. Today's session we thought was going to be a little bit of a niche group, kind of not as general as some of the other topics we've had, specifically around Microsoft tenants, merging, splitting, and migrating them. And we've had an enormous turnout. So clearly this is something that is of interest to people. Something that we've noted is that a lot of our customers are not actually aware what's possible. We've got customers that have 2 or 3 or 4 tenants through acquisitions, mergers, whatever, and they didn't know that they could merge them, or vice versa, that they could split them. A lot of stuff is possible. And today we've got Garry Ackerman from Argantic, who has been doing this for a long, long time. He's seen the movie. He's going to talk us through some scenarios, things to look out for if you're doing it on your own. If you don't want to do it on your own, it goes without saying that you can reach out to us, to your Turrito account manager, or to Garry, and we'll be able to guide you. So without further ado, Garry, thanks very much for joining us, and feel free to kick it off.
Thank you very much, Colin. Thank you everybody for taking the opportunity this afternoon to come and listen to me talk about a topic, as Colin said, that we didn't imagine would be as popular as it's turned out to be. So thank you very much for your time, and enjoy your lunch while I talk to you. Quick agenda to share with you. I'm going to give a little bit of introduction, a bit of background and context to start off with, and then get into a bit of an explanation of how we do these types of tasks. And when I spoke to my team about how best to get into some of the tips and tricks or detail some of the scenarios that we've encountered, what we found was the best way to probably do this is to take you through 4 very specific cases that we have, and then highlight the specific difficulties that we encountered, or you can see the complexity that we had to deal with, and give you a bit of an idea of how we dealt with them. And then as we go along with each of those is to share some of the tips and advice that we can give, or share with you some of the things that we've learned with each of those. And at the end, I'll get into some of the more holistic, so some of the tips that I think apply to absolutely every one of those scenarios, or some of the lessons that we've learned. To give you a bit of context as to why this event is actually happening, we have found over the last few months, also through our partnership with Turrito, that the queries from customers to achieve this kind of outcome has actually escalated. It's quite strangely since the beginning of the year. We've done many of these over the years, but we've done quite a few over the last few months. So we found that with the demand for this type of information or understanding being so high, it would be really, really good for us to have an event of this nature so that we can generally share the information with a broader audience. So I hope you enjoy it and understand why, as I said, when this came up, we all thought it was a little bit of a strange topic, but it's very, very relevant in the modern era based on the demand and queries that we're seeing from the customers that are out there. To get started, our methodology is actually, when it comes to migrations of any sort, merging, splitting, etc., typically deals with 4 very specific areas. Starting in the top left, we deal with security and identity first. We found over the years that unless your security and identity, particularly in your target tenant, is sorted out, your migration is doomed to fail. So it is absolutely the most vital component to deal with. And by that, we're talking about making sure that the users that need to be there are there, and that they're licensed, and that they are members of the correct groups that they need to be members of. If you don't do that, a whole bunch of things just fail, and you'll spend your life trying to untangle a mess of loose strings. The second task is email migration. This is by far the most easiest component. There's 100 tools out there. There's all sorts of native tools based on the tenant that you're using that you can use to migrate emails. They have varying degrees of success, so it's a matter of using the right tool at the right time. But email migration, while it does require some babysitting in most migrations, is probably one of the easier tasks that we deal with. That's followed by absolutely the most difficult task, and that's dealing with data and applications. So the bottom left-hand side represents data and applications. And here you're talking about data that's either sitting on a drive somewhere, on a file server, on users' laptops or desktops, or in third-party storage, either hosted in a data center or online. Dealing with that level of data comes with its own tricky scenarios and very often requires one or more tools to achieve the outcome. And then the last phase of any migration for us is what we call the cleanup. And there you've got quite a few tasks to do. There's no migration that we've had that we've done that hasn't required significant cleanup after the fact. You've got the odd user account that doesn't behave the way it should. You've got the odd email account that's missing something. You've got links in Excel spreadsheets that need to be sorted out. So there's a whole bunch of tasks that need to be dealt with as well. So from a general high-level perspective, this is how we conduct any sort of migration. And it's quite an important methodology for us to follow. And quite a simple one too, but comes with a lot of complications. When we conduct migrations as well, we're always confronted with the last step of the process. And we've got two possibilities here. In the very first image, you see what I thought is characterized as the Big Bang. Excuse me. You can do the Big Bang approach, and believe it or not, while in most projects when it comes to IT, it is undesirable to do Big Bang because you overwhelm the IT department. When it comes to migration, it is desirable. Having your users having one foot in one tenant and another foot on another tenant is a nightmare. Asking users to remember one login is difficult enough. Asking for them to remember two is going to be a problem. However, there are scenarios in the second image that we call the gradual migration. And we've had scenarios where, for instance, one company is buying out a segment of another company, a department or a subdivision within a company, where there's absolutely no choice but during the migration process for these users to exist in two worlds at once. There's no way around it, and you've got to do extra management around that. And there's a way of dealing with it that will limit the impact, but you are absolutely depending on user experience management to make sure that that goes through. So just to reiterate, we've done a few gradual migrations. They are problematic. Where we can, we deal with Big Bang as well. They're also problematic, but less so. So to get into some of these scenarios and to deal with some of the nitty-gritty on how this all works and some of the tips I can share with you, I'm going to take you through 4 very specific case studies. And we picked these because they come with their unique idiosyncrasies to help highlight a lot of the tips and lessons that we've learned and some of the scenarios that you may encounter. And these were all, some of them are generic in nature, but all unique in their own certain way. So let me get into them and we can start getting into the detail of how we go about these. I won't be sharing the customers' names for privacy reasons, but I'll give you the scenarios around which we had to go about this. One of the earlier migrations we did involved a company that existed primarily on a Google Suite, and I think it's now called Google Workplace. I'm using the older image there because they were with Google Suite at that stage, and they'd attempted to do a migration to a Microsoft 365 tenant themselves. Would have been called Office 365 in those days, and in the process had made a few mistakes and got themselves stuck, and then reached out to us for assistance in completing the migration. So one of the big mistakes that they made was they relied on the native tools within the tenant to try and complete the migration themselves, and those are very rudimentary. But the biggest mistake they made was to establish a brand new tenant in the complete wrong country. And as a result, well, they just assumed they could change it later. But as it turns out, and many of those who've dealt with Microsoft tenants will know, once you establish a location, that's where it's stuck. So the assistance here was for us to consolidate a half migrated environment from G Suite and one on Microsoft or Office 365 into a brand new Microsoft 365 tenant that was located in the correct region. While from a user perspective or its sort of identity and security perspective, it wasn't too problematic. The pure migration and merging of data from 2 disparate tenants took its time, and it required us to use our brains quite effectively to get this over the line. So one of the lessons that we learned and that we've embraced ever since is it is virtually impossible to complete a migration of any success or efficiency, as in getting it done relatively quickly, without using one or more third-party applications. There are all sorts of tools embedded in these tenants to help with migrations, but what we have found is that they are far too rudimentary for most applications. So you are looking at commercially buying a tool to help you migrate data from one entity to another, from one tenant to another. The other lesson that we learned is there is almost always more data than you expect, regardless of how diligent you are in the process to start with. There is always data hiding somewhere that you're never told about. And it's only when the migration is in full swing that users are going to arrive with, oh, have you forgotten this? Or what about this data? Which requires getting back to the drawing board and trying to understand the idiosyncrasies of first how the data was stored in the first place and what its purpose was. In many circumstances as well, we have found that you need to be accommodating of strange data types, large data types. And I'll get into this a little bit later in some specific scenarios for some of the really sophisticated customers that we deal with. But there are some weird data types out there that don't natively belong in the cloud or in the SharePoint environment for that matter. The second scenario we dealt with was quite strange. It was an international company that had reached out to us in South Africa because they had a branch out here. And I'm just assuming that they thought any sort of IT work that you're going to be doing internationally is always going to be done, is going to be cheaper when you pay in rands. And I absolutely assume they were right. This was a financial investment company that had built their business to about 150 odd users using G Suite for general modern workplace type activity and Box for company document storage and sort of some sort of automation processes as well. But to give you an idea of what we encountered when we came across the company, this was a company where their ethos was, if you joined them, they kind of handed you the company credit card. You went to the local Incredible Connection, got yourself whatever device you wanted, pitched up at work, logged on and carried on. That's kind of how they operated. So one of the remediations we had to deal with early on was the user device landscape that we encountered. And it was a mix of Mac and Windows. And Mac is not a problem, but in the early days, it was a little bit complicated. But when you're dealing with every second user with a Windows Home Edition, that became a bit of an issue. In their situation as well, one of the things that we had to get over was the sheer size of the amount of data in certain places. Now, one of the things we learned very early on is that your most problematic email account is almost always going to be the CEO or another executive. It's not specifically listed on the lessons learned here because I don't want to be held accountable for this later on. And if you say anything, I'll deny it. But it's almost at that level where the rules apply to everyone else and not them. So when you encounter this, almost 90% of your problem area is going to be on the upper floors of the organization, and you need to prepare for it. In this situation, it was quite literally the CEO stored absolutely everything he could in his email, and it was hundreds of gigs big. And in the early days, trying to migrate massive mailboxes was problematic. Nowadays, not so much anymore. It's something you can accommodate quite nicely, but try asking the CEO to clean up his mailbox. And when you do, can you please video it? Because I want to see something. The amount of data that they stored in Box, by the way, and the problem that came with Box is something we encounter very often, is it essentially just became a dumping site. There was an attempt at a logical structure, and there was an attempt at permissions. And in certain cases, permissions were vital, and in other cases, they weren't. But, when it's all in one storage area like Box, it becomes a little bit of a problem to deal with. And I've got a nice tip around dealing with that type of scenario a little bit later on. But in this situation, one of the key things we learned is that you are not going to be doing a successful migration unless you get vendor assistance. And this is vital. When I mean vendor assistance, it's both vendor assistance from either the source or the target tenant, and the tools you are using to do the migration. Now, everybody that works with Microsoft will know that the landscape is changing all the time. And what we find is that the tools that you use for migration do not change at the same speed. So there are very often scenarios you are going to encounter that the tool vendor has not built a purpose for, and as a result, your migration might stall or come to a grinding halt because of some some error that you encounter that is specifically about something that Microsoft has changed, or that the tool vendor themselves has not built into their product to accommodate. You do not want to be sitting in a situation where you're waiting 2 to 3 days just for the vendor to respond so that your migration can continue. 9 times out of 10, you might end up in a situation where users are in limbo as a result of this. So when it comes to choosing the tools, there's plenty of tools out there that promise you the world. One of the most important things that we can say is please make sure that whatever vendor you use, that they have stellar aftermarket support, because without that, you are going to fail. Excuse me, guys. I do have a bit of a cold, so I have a cough every now and then. The other thing that I can mention to you is, with a lot of the tools that exist out in the marketplace, we have found very few of them that do everything they claim to do. There's tools, for instance, that, as I give you an example, that will claim to do to preserve SharePoint versioning, and it's only when you implement that you find out it's only the last 3 versions. They don't tell you that until you're actually quite far into the process, and there's no assistance beyond that. It's kind of, that's the way it works, and they're not going to do anything about it. So, there's little things like that you need to encounter when choosing the tools and relying on the vendors to make these jobs work. So it doesn't really matter how complicated the scenario is you're dealing with. There are always tools out there to help you deal with that, but you're going to be relying on the reputation of the vendor to get the job done. I've now to not only highlight all the difficult stuff we do, I'm also going to indicate one of the easier migrations we've done. And what we've found is that the less complicated the environment you're migrating from, very often the easier the job is. So in this case, it was a school, and the school phoned me, and I think it was a Wednesday morning. The day's not important, it's just the time frame that's important. They'd been advised that their internet service provider that was hosting both their POP3 mail and their files on some sort of web share was shutting down and was essentially giving them 24 hours. I think they gave them 48 hours to move. And they were in straight out panic mode. So we mobilized a couple of people, and we had a look at the environment. We got full access to the source environment. And in conversation with the school, we said, look, there's no easy way to do this. We're going to have to do big bang, short notice, no preparation of the users. We're essentially going to have to migrate the data and deal with the flack that comes afterwards. We communicated this to everybody, and we asked all the users for a bit of patience, and we went ahead and did it. And this school, we're not talking a huge number of people, it's 40-odd people, and not a huge amount of data either. But we migrated that entire platform in under 24 hours, converted them from the basic environment to Microsoft 365 by the next day. So the Thursday afternoon, they were up and running. And to be honest with you, it wasn't too difficult after that to deal with the user base, to get them to start using the tools properly. And we had to deal with a few instances, but it worked out really, really well. The lesson that we learned from that was that communication with your user group is absolutely vital. And I'm going to deal with a larger topic around user experience a little bit later. But the communication side of it was vital. And what we found was, without that, we would have had a real problem soliciting the cooperation, understanding, and patience of your users. Now, this is something that we'd like to express to anybody that gets involved in a migration. There is no such thing as the perfect migration. We've never had one that has gone perfectly. Even this one had its idiosyncrasies. And you absolutely are going to be relying on the patience and understanding of your users to make sure that you don't end up in a fight every 5 minutes. So that was a very strong lesson that we learned and have applied to all of the migrations we deal with since then. And then more recently, one of the most complicated ones we've ever had to deal with. It was a company that had acquired other companies over time. So you're looking at 3 different tenants. And actually, all 4 of those tenants were active, by the way. So this was a company with 4 independent tenants, 2 of them in a completely different region. And one of them was a split. So we were only taking a piece of one of the tenants and merging it into the final tenant. The original plan was to take 4 tenants and merge them into a 5th one, but actually, if you ever get the opportunity to preserve one of your tenants, please do so. There's already a lot of work that's sitting in that tenant, and it'll make your life a lot easier. We do understand that there are scenarios where you've got to merge things or people have a real desire to migrate older tenants to a brand new environment, and we understand that there's a use case for that. But in this scenario, we managed to convince the customer that the existing tenant that the head office was using was more than suitable for their requirements, and that simplified things greatly. In all of these cases, we then had to selectively migrate the existing tenant to the Microsoft environment. And you'd think Microsoft to Microsoft migrations would be easier. It's not necessarily the case. You still need the tools, and you still go through the exact same processes. What we found was that splitting a tenant is not actually that difficult. A lot of the tools that you have will allow you to selectively select users and just migrate those users. The difficult part is splitting up their data. So it's a user task that the companies had to go through, was separating out data that was specific to one company versus another. And we had to migrate only that portion of it to avoid having to take the whole lot across, or to actually end up in a situation where data has been moved across that actually didn't belong to that company. The split was happening because a large proportion of the entity was being sold off to somebody else, and it was only a department that was being retained for the merge into the grander scheme of things. In this situation, we learned that, and it's something that we've been doing unconsciously anyway, but this is probably one of the largest data set elements that we've ever dealt with. And we learned the lesson that it is absolutely vital that regardless of the size of the data you're dealing with, is to break it up into much smaller pieces and to migrate the data in those individual pieces. Every time we've attempted to do a bulk migration of a large amount of data, more often than not at the customer's insistence, it's delayed the project by weeks. And the reason why is very often, and all these tools, by the way, deal with large data sets, especially when you're moving from something like migration in the same way. The tools will index the data in situ. That on its own can take a couple of days, just the indexing itself. And what it means is if any of the data changes location in the interim while you're actually starting the migration itself, your migration process will fail. If you break your data up into much smaller pieces, you're probably still going to encounter that process, however, or that problem. However, the indexing process will take an hour or two at most. And by the time you encounter that small error, the remediation is a lot easier to deal with. The other benefit is that you can run these in parallel. So instead of trying to move all the data at once and hoping that it just goes smoothly, you can run 4 or 5 migrations at the same time and the data moves smoothly across. It allows you to deal with remediation on the individual errors that occur without having to stop the entire migration itself. So this is something that's very important, and something that we've now we just do this as a standard. To give you an idea, when looking at large amounts of data, it's virtually impossible to scour through it and understand what you're dealing with. But we've had customers that have stored rather problematic AutoCAD diagrams in SharePoint. You're talking 150, 200 gig per file. And while SharePoint stores them, no problem, it wasn't designed for that. And you enter all sorts of problems dealing with those size of data. More recently, we had a customer that was storing some older backups that they wanted to keep for historical purposes in SharePoint. You're talking 300-400 gigs a file. Once again, SharePoint was not dealt with that. It was not designed for that. What we did in all of those cases, by the way, is you deal with the larger files individually. You don't use the tools for that. You just deal with it manually, and you make sure that those are migrated and completed, or you put them where they're supposed to be. So now those are the 4 very specific scenarios, and I'm more than happy to talk individually to anybody if you want to bring up some other scenarios that you want to deal with. And we've had quite a variety of experience, and I've got members of my team here today to deal with anything that you might want to ask that I can't deal with. But there are some specific things that apply to all of these scenarios that I would advise. And the very first one I touched on a little bit earlier is to solicit the assistance of your user base and make user experience an absolutely vital component of the project itself. 9 times out of 10, unfortunately, we encounter situations where we are told Don't worry about it. The IT team knows the users. We will deal with those, and we'll handle that. It's a way of trying to avoid one of the bigger cost elements in the project itself, and I would dissuade that approach. Rather make it a formal part of the project, get marketing involved if you need to, but make sure the user experience is fundamental to your project. If you don't do that, you're going to have all sorts of problems. As I said to you before, we have not done a migration that hasn't resulted in some sort of humdinger at some point in time. It happens. You can't plan for it. What has happened, what's worked really well for us is where we've prepared the user base for that. They're very accommodating. They understand what you're going through, and they give you the time and space to resolve it amicably. And as a result, you have a much better experience from start to finish. And then the last tip that I would give you is we're available to help. Trying to do this on your own, it's absolutely possible, but make sure you've got somebody on hand at some point in time, even in an advisory capacity, to help guide you through this. We can tell you that none of the vendors and none of the marketing documents that are shared with users around migrations tell the truth. They are a lot more complicated than the vendors make out to be. And it really does require you to have an experienced and steady hand at the steering wheel to make sure that these go through very successfully. And, you know, we've got the scars, we've bought the T-shirts, we can help you through with this process. And I see I'm spot on 30 minutes, so I think this is the time. I think we're going straight into Q&A.
Well done, Garry. Yeah, you did an excellent job with the timing. And again, for those of you who haven't joined these sessions before, we do like to keep it short and sweet so that it doesn't take up too much of your day. Having said that, so if you want to jump off, if you have to jump off, feel free to do that. You're not going to offend Garry or me. So jump off if you need to. If you have time to hang around and you have questions, please shoot. You can raise your hand and ask. You can put a message in the chat, whatever suits you. You can obviously also follow up with an email if that's easier, if you've got any questions or queries or comments.
If there's any queries about the tools we use, just reach out to me privately. It really does depend on the scenario. There's a whole bunch of them that we've used at different times, and they're all very successful at what they do in certain scenarios.
Cool. Well, if there aren't any questions, Garry, thanks to Garry, we've nailed it on the time. Tinas, your hand is up.
Hi, thanks, Colin, and hello to everyone. Hi, Garry. We went through a tenant migration. I was involved with a tenant migration, not directly, some time ago. You know, we partnered with a company. They had a client that you installed on the desktop. We went through the indexing. We went through everything that you mentioned. In the end, we pulled the trigger, and it was a blank. It was excuse my French, a shit show of note. So what would happen in that case? I mean, you did all the prep work, and when I mean nothing, I mean there was nothing on the other side. So we were stuck in limbo for it was a good couple of days. I remember the one team call. It was an ongoing Teams call for 38 hours, ongoing, with various teams from Microsoft. You know, the client that we use, client contacts, and you know, we made it work. I can't remember how, but you know, just maybe some indication of, you know, when these scenarios happen, what do you do?
That's where your vendor. So first of all, use tools that are reputable. We've had that exact same scenario a number of times. And as a result, there's specific tools we don't use for specific scenarios anymore. There's some, by the way, that are just brilliant at migrating email. You start them and you leave them and they're done. But when it comes to the migration of the data, and as you say, it just, you don't get any feedback. There's no log files. There's nothing that you've actually got to log calls with the vendors themselves to try and get this thing sorted out. The tool vendor points at Microsoft. Microsoft points at the tool vendor. You know, been at that scenario. We've found, however, as of late, the tools that we use, we're not in that scenario anymore. They're very, very helpful, and we've managed to resolve. We don't encounter that situation anymore because of the specific tools we use at specific times.
All right. No, that's fine. Well, in this example, it was 2 Microsoft tenants. So where did the information end up? So now you're migrating from one to another. You sort of can't find it on the other side, but it doesn't exist on the original side. Just out of curiosity, where does it end up?
Most of the tools we use will use a Azure-based staging environment. Ironically, one of those we used in the old days used an AWS staging environment. So it builds up your staging somewhere intermediary. Obviously, Azure is going to be much faster than anywhere else. So we've learned that lesson as well. But a lot of the tools we use, Azure is their staging environment, and it's part of the price you pay. And that's where the vendor itself has access to those types of environments. I remember there was one tool in the early days, though, that didn't do any sort of staging. It did like a pre-indexing. And then when it came to the migration, it just started to move the data. And we found that just became a problem, because if anything changed, the whole thing would just collapse in a heap of fire.
Okay. Do you have any examples of ones that you did that had the same result as our one, and the actions you took to get it going again?
Well, we had one where it stood still for 4 days, and then just suddenly started again. We think the vendor did something in the background. They didn't admit it to us, but that was the scenario that we dealt with. I don't want to publicly mention the tool, but I will privately mention to you the tool that we use there.
Okay, 100%. Thanks.
We've got a couple of questions, Garry. One of them, you mentioned not getting locked up in the wrong region. Can you clarify this? What would be a determinant for the right tenant region?
So when you start a tenant, you're asked in what region to create it. That's how it gets locked. From that day onwards, that tenant is in that region, and it can't. I want to say it can't be changed. I just think Microsoft won't change it. They absolutely refuse. There was a tenant migration. I know it is possible, because a lot of us, for instance, as partners and customers that started Microsoft tenants that were outside of South Africa before we had a region, were all in the UK and US and places like that. And then Microsoft allowed a window where you could choose to migrate them to South Africa. So it is technically possible. But we've had a lot of customers that started their tenants in the UK, and then missed out on the migration window. And now if you want to move them, you've got to move tenant to tenant migration. You've got to move your data.
If I can just add about the determinant for the right tenant region, that's also, that's business specific. Some businesses have rules around data sovereignty, information protection rules. If they do work in the EU, they've got to adhere to different, principles or policies than we do. So all of that would be a very business specific decision about where the data actually needs to live. Yeah. Abuyomi, I hope we covered that okay. I'm going to move on to the next question, but type in the chat if we haven't. Cornet asks, we bought another company, it runs on a different tenant. Will there be downtime for the sister company should we migrate them to the main company? Or if the mail gets migrated and loaded as an alias, will it just work once live? So that's the first part of the question. The second part, Garry, which I know you can deal with, is also license cost will play a role because of the 300 license threshold. I assume Cornet is talking about the business type of Office 365 licenses, not the E SKUs. So presumably the sister company had less than 300 users, and now the combined tenant is going to have more than 300 users. So what do you do in a scenario like that? Excellent question. Might take a little bit of time to answer. And again, just to remind you guys, if you do want to jump off, feel free. But if you can hang around, that's awesome.
So let me deal with that in 2 parts. The first one is actually our methodology is very simple. So if we've got 2 different tenants, the source tenant and what we do is we migrate all of the data to the target tenant before the cutover actually takes place. And all of the tools that we use will allow you to do a bulk migration and then a series of delta migrations after the fact. So what we do is we try and get the user base, the target tenant, to a point as close to the source tenant as possible before we do the cutover. What we like to do then is when you do the domain cutover from one tenant to the other, there is a small window of time where you may possibly lose some emails. It's a small, and it depends entirely on what happens with the sender. Anybody that's using an intermediate delivery mechanism, and I'll name one that I know of, like Mimecast, for instance, doesn't have this problem, because Mimecast will just attempt to redeliver as soon as the new domain is across. But we have found that there is a small window between the two tenants when you do your cutover, where there is a small potential of data loss. From a downtime perspective, generally no, because you can give users access to the email and data environments via a web browser while we deal with the desktop complexities that come across with changing profiles. So we have found that you can minimize that just by planning correctly and making sure your cutover, we do cutovers generally on Friday afternoon or the day before a public holiday or something of that nature.
Especially with Cape Town companies, I mean, on a Friday, even earlier, right? 12.
Yeah,
Joburg,
Friday like 10 o'clock. We
4
can sort you
p.m.
out, no problem.
Yeah, 10 o'clock. And then cover the 300 threshold, 300 license threshold issue.
The problem is real, and you have to make sure. So what we say is to make sure that your target tenant is completely and properly licensed. Unfortunately, unless you can somehow convince Microsoft to give you 300 trial licenses, which I'm sorry, I've never been able to do, you have to make sure that the environment is properly licensed as it's going to be in its final state. Now, we have had situations before where we've migrated from an e-license on one tenant to a business license on the other. You must understand that you've got different size limits for different elements, and you need to plan for those accordingly. So don't move from an E to a business without checking the size of the mailboxes first. But unfortunately, you are in a situation where your target environment needs to be properly licensed for the users that you're going to bring across.
If I can add to that, Garry, the 300 threshold only refers to the business SKU M365 licenses, right? So you could have hypothetically 299 business standards and 50 E3s in the same tenant. Am I right?
You can go beyond that. You can have different mixes of the business. So the business SKU 300 limit is per SKU. So you could have 300 business standard, 300 business premium, 300 business essentials.
Okay,
so you can mix it like that.
That I think would solve your problem without being a huge budgetary concern. In other words, 50 business standards, 100 business premiums, E1s. You could have a huge selection of license types that are as affordable as they can be on a per user basis, and not have to convert all of your licenses to like E3 or something that would be very expensive. Richard, I saw your hand go up very briefly. Do you want to add something to that topic?
I would just like to confirm on that, having a total of the business licenses, or whether you can, I'd just like to check with a Microsoft expert on that before we commit. I think it's a total of business licenses. I don't think you can have up to 300 of each SKU. Please, can we just confirm and come back on that?
Richard, okay. You're a Microsoft expert, so I don't know where's this going to go.
I'm going to check it right now. I just don't want us to make a commitment.
I've gotten away with that in the past, but I do know there's been a whole series of additional rules lately. So you may be right, Rich. We need to just check on that one.
I'd prefer before we get too excited.
Sorry, Corné, have we covered your question adequately? I'll carry on going in the meantime. Friedel, I see your hand, but let me get to Jean's question next quickly. Extending on Corné's question, Microsoft has been talking about multi-tenant organizations. Has that reached a point of maturity yet? As in, can you create a single tenant experience between two tenants? I've never heard of that. Is Garry, Richard?
Yeah, it is something that you can do. So you could. It's called I think it's called geolocation. So you'll have multi. They're not talking about multi-tenancy just yet. I know it's on the radar. I don't think it's come to fruition yet. But what they have done, and what we did with one of the manufacturing companies we deal with, they have businesses in Brazil, in the US, in China, and Australia. What we did was we created geolocations to give the data geo-residency for those specific users, and they were attached to those. It does cost extra, and it does come with complications, but it is physically possible. But I have not heard of the multi-tenancy component of that yet.
And with your geolocation scenario, does Entra ID cover everything across all of the geolocations? Your policies, group policy, all of that stuff?
They can apply to everything, or they can apply very specifically to the geolocation. So you can have fidelity. Just to come back and confirm, I did query it as well while Richard was looking at them. My initial assertion is correct. You can add 300 business standards to 300 business premiums.
Okay, I thought there was a bit of a workaround there. Okay, cool.
Yep.
Friedel, I don't know, I don't see you anymore, but your hand was up. Friedel, you...
Hi, Colin. Yes, thanks. Just to that, we've got about 350 users, give or take. Some on business standard, some on business basic, and a bunch of users on F1 licenses. So our total tenant is about 300. But it's split between different licenses, so that is possible.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. Cornet, Jean, have we covered the questions adequately? A bunch of people are having to jump off, which is totally understandable, and a bunch of you saying this has been an informative session, which we appreciate. I think, but yeah, as I've mentioned right at the beginning, if you've got any other questions, email us, reach out, get in touch. We appreciate it. And without further ado, I'm going to shut things down so you guys can get back to your day jobs. Hope you've enjoyed this. Garry, thanks again for your presentation, and it's awesome to see you guys. Hopefully see you in person sometime soon.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your lunch.
Cheers, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.